Did you know that Netflix removed React and their website is 50% faster as a result? Sounds crazy, right? I know it has to be true because I saw it on Twitter. Look, here it is. It's a real picture from what seems like a real presentation. Obviously, this is a really big deal, right? Right? This isn't misinformation. There isn't a community note proposed. This isn't somebody grifting their shitty AI startup and using React drama they don't understand 7 years later, is it? We have a lot to talk about here. The reality is that using React correctly is both really simple and somewhat complicated. And the things the Netflix team has done to make React a good experience for their devs and to make their website a good experience for their users are really interesting and nuanced and worth the conversation. Not a shitpost, a conversation. I would love to have that conversation, and there's a lot of interesting details here. Everything about how HTML is generated, how JavaScript is bundled, to why you would use React for a landing page or your terms of service. Can't wait to dive into all of this with you, but first, a really quick word from today's sponsor. In software dev, there are two hard problems: naming things, off-by-one errors, and live sync. If you've ever tried to make things sync between multiple users at once before, you know how painful it is, especially once you start adding an auth, data management, querying, re-rendering, and all of that chaos. So here's a live syncing chat. Already has auth and everything set up too. Sup, nerds. See how it appears in both immediately? There's no trickery here. There's no live client-side syncing. I'm not using the multi-windows. Let's see the code for it. That's all of it. This is all of the front-end code. How does that possibly happen? This can't be real, right? Not only is it real, it's really convex. These guys make it way too easy to handle the entirety of your backend for React applications and other frameworks too, to be fair. I'm a React nerd, I'm sure you are too. It's really good for that. The backend code is just as simple. You don't even need to be a backend dev to get around it. You can literally command click on the thing you're hitting on the front end with use query or mutation and see and hear how it's defined. The list query has no arguments and has a simple handler that uses the database in order to get the last 100 messages and send them to the user. And send does validate that you send a body and an author and then handles that new message. Schema's adorably simple. It's nuts how easy this is to work with. And that's all it takes, really. It really is that simple. Go give them a shot if you haven't yet. Check them out today at soydev.link/convex. If you look into the community note here, it drops a really useful link for context, which is this Y Combinator conversation on the Hacker News board from 2017. Let's dive in. As a starting point, there's a lot of nuance to dive into here, but I think here will be a good start. Hey, I work on the team at Netflix that gave the talk on React in the sign-up flow in the tweet. The full talks are available here if people want to watch them. Link to the talk. Though I'd also provide some more context on some common questions people have asked. Let's hear it. Why are you using React to render a landing page? The Netflix landing page is a lot more dynamic than most people think it is. I should give a little additional context first. They didn't remove React from the code base. They didn't remove React from the app. All they did is server run and server render the landing page in React so that you don't need the JavaScript on the client side. So the only thing React was removed from is the bundle that you load of JavaScript on the client on the home page. As they say here, though, because the first question you'll ask is, well, if you removed React, why would you even use it for the render? Just write it in anything else. It's just HTML. Just write the HTML. You're lazy. You're dumb. You're a JS soy dev. What are you doing? There are good reasons. As this engineer points out, the Netflix landing page is significantly more dynamic than most people probably think. It's our most heavily A/B tested page in the signup flow, with even some machine learning models being used to customize the messaging and imagery that you get, depending on location, whether or not you were previously a Netflix member, your device type, and a lot more. This isn't some AI grift going on now. A reminder that this was over 7 years ago. Even beyond that, Netflix supports almost 200 countries now, and there's a different combination of localization, legal challenges, and value messaging for each one. We end up sharing a lot of the logic in the UI for these A/B testing and localization challenges throughout the sign-up flow, mainly through React components. Crazy. It turns out, as your HTML gets more dynamic in terms of the things it might result in, React's a good solution to the problem. There are other ways to template your HTML, but if your company's already building everything in React, you already have this page written in React, you just want it to be faster, you can use all of these tools to render the right HTML with React and just send the HTML down to the user. If you've been around recently, this might sound familiar to something the React team introduced. Don't spoil yourself though, we're going to get there in a little bit. The example I always love to give is the terms of use component that we have, which to a Netflix customer signing up, it's literally 1 or 2 checkboxes in the UI, but it has some of the most complicated logic in the code base due to the vast number of countries and user states that we support. Because of all of this, it's more valuable for us to share these custom React components across the entire sign-up process, both for the landing page and for the rest of the flow, which is a single-page React and Redux application. Again, they can share everything. They're just generating the result for the user ahead of time on the server. Kind of sounds like server components, right? We'll get there. I also love the terms of use in terms of service example, not because everyone has these really dynamic flows with it, but because it is consistently one of the things that requires the most data to be fetched and double fetched. If we go to ping.gg, which is an app I built using the old way of building with Next.js, TypeScript, React, all that, and we go to the terms of service page, we'll see something interesting. If I go to the network tab and we grab something like provided by T3 Tools and we search for this, you'll see this came up in 2 places. Not 2 places in one file, but 2 different files. We have the ping.gg/info/whatever here, which is the actual HTML response. And if I open this in my editor, you'll see this is the HTML page that my computer fetched when I went to the URL. And this includes all of the information for this terms of service. We have all these H2 and P tags that are the terms of service, which is included in the HTML. Cool. That's how the web works. Nothing special here, right? One more thing. We also reload the exact same data in JavaScript, because when we server render with the old model for React, we create the default HTML state, but we need to run the exact same JS code on the server and the client. So the code that resulted in that being done properly and having the right things in the terms of service, all of that, including every single word of your terms of service, has to be included in the JS bundle that then reruns, re-renders, and reattaches everything as soon as the page loads. That sucks hard. The fact that you have to double fetch all of this data, that you have to have all of the copy in here again, even though it's there already, it's just in the HTML, that sucks. And server components help solve this significantly, because when you use a server component, you don't have to send all of the same stuff down as JS. It can just be the HTML representation. We'll go there in a little bit. I keep getting ahead of myself. We've seen a lot of conversion value through improving the performance of the landing page, especially in countries with slower connections. But we don't also want to reduplicate a lot of the shared UI logic that we have. I will say, if your connection is slow enough, you can't get through the sign up for Netflix, how the fuck are you going to stream a movie on Netflix? For other companies, like if this was Amazon or Walmart or a bank, this would make a lot of sense. But if your internet's too slow to sign up for Netflix, what's your experience going to be like watching it? The trade-off we decided to make is to server render the landing page using React, but also prefetching React Redux in the code for the rest of the sign-up flow while we're on it. This optimizes the first load performance, but it also optimizes the time to load for the rest of the sign-up flow, which has a much larger JS bundle size to download since it's a single-page app. This all makes sense. It's starting to sound a little bit like server components. Here's where things start to get fun. Here is Sophie, who was at the time an employee on the React team. Now she just contributes externally. I work on React. We'd love to hear from your team sometime and collaborate on this sort of thing. We're solving many of the same problems, but I rarely hear from Netflix engineers except at talks where they're announcing that they're avoiding React or they have forked it, often for reasons that we weren't even aware of. Yeah, there was a lot of this at the time. People reinventing parts of React or forking or gutting and doing all these things and giving these bombastic talks about it without bothering to reach out or talk to the React team. It's gotten better. It was a two-sided problem because the React team didn't make it clear how open they were to these types of things. They've gotten much better about that. It's pretty easy to get a hold of them if you really want to, if you have a compelling enough reason, especially if you work at a big company. The reason this was written is almost certainly because they had started exploring how server components would work. The harsh but somewhat fun reality of all of the benefits that were described here is if they were using the new server component model, it would have done almost all of the exact same things. You could have had components be reused on the landing page and in other places, and when you render them on the server, they're a server component, and when you render them on the client, they're a client component. Awesome. You could have had the terms of use be dynamic based on users' cookies and whatnot, and you have to load all the different possible states as JS. You just load the one the user wants. I have a weird example of this. Here is Upload Thing. If you don't already know, it's an app I built and got a little 3D printed thing of here to make it easier to add file uploads to your apps. And when I say file uploads, I don't mean I go dump it somewhere in a web UI and then let users see the file. I mean users can upload files. UGC is a really hard thing to handle properly when users are uploading their own content. We built a great way to do that, especially if you're a full stack dev, especially if you're a Next dev. I'm not here to just shell upload thing though. I already did my shelling earlier. I'm here to show you guys how server components made this much easier to build and work with. So here we have my apps. You might have noticed all of these have these fancy little backgrounds to make it a little clearer that they're different from each other. I'm using hero patterns for that. Hero patterns is a source of patterns that are open source for you to grab as SVGs and use in your stuff. It's really cool. I have all of these in a giant file here. And I mean it when I say giant. If I reveal in Finder, utils, generate pattern, this file alone is 205 kilobytes of JavaScript. And all it is all of the SVG patterns that I would want to render. Historically, you would not ever, ever, ever want to do this in your JavaScript code. Because if you do this in your JavaScript code, now this giant file gets loaded to the user. This one file is bigger than the entirety of React, which is kind of absurd. That would be really bad. The alternative way to do this, the traditional way, would be instead of the SVGs all being here, you would load them remotely once the content loads, but then you don't have the nice embedded behavior where the patterns are there right when the page loads. You have to wait for them to be fetched separately from the server in a different round trip. Not ideal. So how do we make sure all of these patterns can exist in our code and that we can generate HTML using the right SVGs without having to load all of this on the client? It's actually quite simple. It's done. This file works that way. If I want it to work differently, then I go wherever this exists. So we find that I call this in page TSX. If I want this to be on the client side, it's easy. I go up here, use client. Now this file loads JavaScript to the user. Without this here, get random pattern styles and the things from that function and the things from that code do not go to the user. I'm able to specify an unbelievable number of permutations in different states the UI can be in and represent that in my code and not have to ship all of those potential states to the user. The way to think about this is when you look at something like this UI, your code needs to handle all the different states the UI could be in. It needs to handle the empty state. It needs to handle the loading state. It needs to handle the state with 15 apps. It needs to handle the state with one app. It needs to handle the different states with the different backgrounds for all of those different apps. So every permutation your UI could be in, code has to exist for it. There's a pattern to describe this way of thinking called server-driven UI, where instead of the server giving the client data that the client then uses to figure out which version of the UI to show you, what if the server drove the UI? What if the server told the client, hey, your UI should look like this? That's how the web used to work. Apps, and I'll admit, single-page apps and websites built that way with stuff like React, encourage a different way of thinking, where your HTML would have nothing in it. You'd load a little bit of JS, which would then go fetch JSON, and then generate the HTML on the user's device, which means every single way the HTML can render has to exist in the JS first. Server components mean you don't have to have that code representing all of those permutations on the client's device anymore. It can run on the server and just send their permutation to them. So I have 400 something patterns in that file here, at least probably. So I have all of these patterns and all of these things, but all that loads is the actual HTML for the ones being rendered. That's the magic of server components. So now imagine instead of these being different patterns that could or couldn't render, these are different countries. And instead of it rendering 15 of them, it renders one. But each of them has different needs, and that theoretical JavaScript file is huge with all the different copy for all the different languages, for all the different expectations that can exist. And now you have to render all of those different permutations, which means the JavaScript has to include everything for every language. Now, when I load the United States version, I loaded the code for the India version too. I loaded the code for the Germany version too. I loaded all of the different JavaScript for all the different states that URL could potentially be in. The magic of server components is you're only fetching for the things that you're actually rendering. So if I am loading this page in the US, it's not going to load the JavaScript for the India or the Germany version. It's going to just load the things that I rendered. It solves this problem. They effectively re-implemented server components with what they were describing here, which is hilarious because if you implement this with server components the right way, your savings are probably going to be even bigger than 50%. We've already seen this with a lot of applications taking advantage of these things. Server components allow you to have server code that generates HTML that doesn't result in additional JavaScript going to the user. And this isn't just reinventing PHP, because PHP doesn't let you write client code. You can have a component that on client works the way I'm describing, and on server is not sending JavaScript to the user, and you can reuse it in both places. That is a concept that nothing has had before it. And sure, the server sending HTML might feel like PHP, but if you think this is just PHP, then you understand neither PHP nor the browser. Sorry to call you out, random chatter, but this is the stupidest thing anyone said today, and I cannot believe that you watch my stuff if you actually think this is the case. Anyways, if you want proof of this, there's a really good example. I have a video that should probably already be out by now. It's called Next Faster. There's a website called McMaster that people seem to think is vanilla HTML, and that's why it's so fast, when in reality, it's using a shitload of JS, like multiple megabytes of it, in order to make it feel as fast as it is. Ethan Neisser and crew rebuilt it with a service called Next Faster. It's not a rebuild, it's inspired, but it's for school materials and shit. It's even faster. When I click things, I'm clicking now. They load immediately, because it turns out Next.js in server rendering makes it pretty easy to do this. And the coolest part of the new model is you get to choose when it stops being just HTML and starts being client-side JS, and you can pass things from the server to the client as HTML. So, to showcase why server components are so different from previous models, I made a simple example. Imagine in docs, you have the little tabs for like TypeScript or JavaScript or Python, HTML, whatever. There's one of those tab bars. You have these little tabs, tab A, tab B, tab C. And when you click them, they're under different contents. I passed all of these as props. We have tab contents, tab equals A, tab equals B, tab equals C. And I have this little helper function, tab contents. And it console logs rendering tab components for tab. If I do this the way you guys are used to, ignore that. I go here, I refresh, I click tab C, it logs. I click tab B, it logs. The reason is all of this JavaScript is running on the client, as it should. What happens if I delete that, though? We see we're getting these server logs, but these are being injected by Next. It's a cool thing they do that, but these aren't happening on the client side. They're just forwarding those over for me. Client side, and you'll see here as I click between the tabs, there are no new logs. How? What's going on here? One of the really cool things you can do with server components that doesn't exist in any other framework right now is when you pass something that is a server rendered component like we have here with tab contents, and I pass that as a prop to a client component, which obviously tab wrapper has a useState call, so it is a client component. It renders all of these states on the server because they're all being passed as props. So now A, B, and C get rendered on the server and all get passed down as what is effectively HTML, so to speak, to the client. So they all get pre-rendered on the server, and now we don't have to wait between them. They're all there. They're all in the HTML. They're all in the browser. And even though we have these different states that all could exist and all were generated in this code that does exist and does run, none of that affects the end user. None of this goes to the user. They'll never have to know about it, as they shouldn't. Now you can have an infinite number of these different conditions, and none of that is loading as JS that the user gets. And we don't give up the dynamic behaviors and controls that we normally get from React. We just have the option to intermingle these things that don't ship JS to the user with the things that do. It is a new paradigm. It is really cool, and it solves all of the problems that are being described in this 7-year-old comment from a 7+-year-old talk that is being misused by an AI grifter to get free attention. And I cannot believe I'm giving him even more fucking attention by doing this, but it is the stupidest thing I've seen in such a long time that I had to rage a little bit. Because not only is this problem being deeply misunderstood, it also has been solved by the new solutions, and the people who are sharing this thing unironically like it's a big problem are the same people who are bitching about the new solutions and saying, oh, we just reinvented PHP. No, we didn't. This is something new. And if you can't see how this is something new, you're struggling to see. That's not our fault anymore. Enough of us have done a good enough job at explaining why this pattern is cool and why we're able to build things as performant as we do with really good public examples like Next Faster, which is open source for you to go look at and see how you can make things that are super dynamic with a ton of stuff going on, both in the markup and the data model, without having a thing that sucks to use. I will offer some sympathy though. If you were at Netflix at the peak of the single page app craze, These solutions didn't exist. And I can understand why you would do something drastic like reinvent how your HTML is being rendered so you can rip the React part out of it. I get it. You didn't have server components yet, but now we do. And continuing to reference examples from years ago, from almost a decade ago, like these tools haven't improved since, it's embarrassing. And I really hope we stop sharing these things like they're real or sincere or meaningful commentary on how React works for production when nobody at Netflix would say this is the right thing to do today. Nobody who built it would say it, and I am explaining to you how to do it right instead. Stop sharing things you don't understand because they're dunking on a thing you don't like. And stop the AI grifting shit. I'm so done with it. God. I got nothing else on this one. Peace, nerds.